Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Author Talks, to ladies and gentlemen and everyone in between, my podcast which focuses on me talking about things, primarily, reading short stories and such. This week, a topic that I was reminded of by a shared blog post, sort of one of those things you get on Facebook. Here's your memory from X amount of time ago. And it was a post on my website's blog called The Body of Fantasy. And it was about not fantasy, the corpus as a whole, because writing about that in a single article is suicidal. But it was about a concept that I noticed and really got driven home to me during a playthrough of a kind of guilty pleasure game of mine, Dragon Age Inquisition. That game has a problem with its different peoples. I really don't like to use the term races. It's peoples. That all the humans are perfectly proportioned, all the Kunari are like bodybuilders, all the dwarves are stocky and have square faces, all the elves are slim, svelte things that have teardrop-shaped faces, and goodness me, all the women happen to be shorter or the same size as the men, except the Kunari, and also all the women tend to be slimmer. I think you can see where this is going. It's well, the thing about the game is it has technical limitations. Boy, howdy does it have technical limitations. But it's also falling into a trap of a standardized, unified body appearance that is demonstrably not a real thing in real life and in other works of science fiction and fantasy. This is something that is brought more home to me now more than ever, because I am working on a fantasy trilogy at the moment, and one of the challenges I set myself was a diverse cast. Not just in the sense of their ethnic origins, or their gender, or their sexuality, or their gender identity, but in terms of their physical appearance. It's a truth, a truism of sorts, that people gravitate towards a unified look. It's part of the somewhat pervasive concept of beauty standards that has existed for hundreds, if not probably thousands of years, and has changed from era to era, from people to people, from nation to nation. At this moment I am holding a book in my hand that is a demonstration of that in a sense. The book it's a reprinting of a selection of letters by the Paston family that lived in Norwich during the medieval period. How far does this book extend? Let's see. The book's letter selection extends from the 1440s to the early 1500s, but the full extent of the Paston letter collection, I think, extends from the 13 or 1400s right into the 1600s, the 17th century or 1600s. But the front cover is a picture, and they should tell me what the picture is in the thing here. In the do they tell me what the do they actually tell me what the cover is in this little section of stuff saying Publisher X, reprint Y? I can't see it so far. Well, I assume it's a copy of a painting from roughly that same period, I assume. And everyone looks astoundingly alike. And not, there's part of a reason for that. It could be that it's portraying a family. In fact, it probably is, considering the context of the book. Here is the here is the cover illustration thing. It's on the back of the book, and the illustration is from Four Conditions of Society, Nobility by Jean Baudisson. I probably butchered that pronunciation, sorry. An artist that lived between 1457 and 1521. So, yeah, within the realm of the Pastons existing, and the Pastons writing these letters that got preserved. But it's a fact that there was an artistic standard for people, and you don't just see it in things like this. You see it in the portrayals of peasants, you see it in stained glass. It's partly to do with the fact that realistic, in quotes, artistic portrayals of people weren't as much of a thing. The realism movement hadn't emerged as much. But it's also a case of a standard of how things were. It's part of the reason that there's a long-standing inaccurate assumption that there were no people of colour in medieval Britain / Europe. There were, very much so. There are records of them, there is pictorial evidence of them, but because they are not the commonality, then it can be assumed by certain filmmakers that they just weren't around. I'm not going to name any names, but you probably know the ones I'm talking about. The ones that, maybe don't get the, say, Roman Empire was not all exclusively Italian. That the Roman Empire didn't work like that. It was very multicultural. It was just the concept of a national Roman identity regardless of your origin, as long as you were from the Roman Empire and were a Roman citizen. You could be... you were from Africa, from Judea, from the furthest northern extremes of Britain that they managed to conquer, and you were a Roman. It's a bit like... the groups of... It's very, very actually like the groups in America being American, even if their origins are from Ireland, from Africa, from South America, from China, Japan, anywhere within America that has a diaspora that has American citizenship. There is it's American. They are insert prefix here, American, and it's sort of an extension of that same idea. But anyway, back to commonalities. The concept of a norm, a homogenized norm, is not the norm. Certainly not in books, because in books you have a wide variety of imagination, a vast oeuvre of maybe that's an exaggeration, or maybe I'm using the wrong term, but that kind of sensation of the imagination running free, being able to do whatever the heck you want. And, example, Adrian Tchaikovsky's Children of Man, and that associated series. Some of the main protagonists from that are a species of spider that have achieved space flight and are uplifting other species. They are not, most definitely they are not humanoid, and that's a whole thing. Insert. I meant the Children of Time. That was a big boo-boo on my part. Apologies. End of insert. Then there is David Brin's The Uplift War, which has the concept of the story is a drama and sort of scenario set within a group of interstellar nations that have uplifted other species, sort of, given them technology in some stage and sort of uplifted them and essentially become their patron species. One of the ones we're introduced to early on is a bird species, and there's another one that has communication done through a head full of tentacles. That is all incredible and amazing. And then there's things like radio, which can communicate all manner of things. Yes, you can have a human-like voice there, but Journey into Space is an old science fiction serial, and you don't see, in the first series, you don't see the aliens. You hear their voice. You don't necessarily see them, or don't get a description of them. so we're left completely up in the air as to what they look like. That's part of the show's strength as a radio production. And you'll notice I'm speaking a lot about science fiction. Science fiction is where a lot of otherness can reside, the concept of the alien, the other. But fantasy definitely has it too. I mean, Dragonheart is one of my unironic favourite fantasy movies. I don't know what it is about fantasy movies in the 90s, but they seem to have a special certain something, which means they've aged better than stuff from the 70s and 80s. If you compare how Krull and Dragonheart have aged, then Dragonheart has aged a whole lot better than Krull ever did, if I'm going to be honest. Krull is in the territory of bad and it's good also, kind of the wiggle room territory stuff, and suffers from the same problem a lot of fantasy stuff has at that time, where it's just a royal road of go here, do that, and conceit happens that moves the story along. The thing about Dragonheart is that, well, the main conceit of the show, it's a kind of chalk and cheese friendship story between a dragon hunter and apparently the last dragon in existence in that part of the world, maybe the whole world. And yes, the dragon's face is somewhat anthropomorphized, and is voiced by Sean Connery, but the thing is that it's a dragon. It's a huge great winged lizard. It's not human, it's barely even humanoid. In fact, it's not humanoid, it's a giant winged lizard. But that character, Draco, is one of the most compelling characters in the entire film, and his tragedy is central to how the plot goes. I think that's part of the reason why it's aged fairly well, even if the writing or performances and the CGI may not have aged very well in some places. Certainly its portrayal of a medieval civilization is a little dodgy. There is that thing of a good story, a very sound plot with not necessarily a thoroughly happy ending by any means. It's dark. I think that would qualify as that period's dark fantasy, but I don't think it is classed as dark fantasy. It's just plain old fantasy. But that's the thing. But when you look at a lot of fantasy that tends to get adapted, I think this is partly an adaptation thing, probably derived from the fact that until quite recently the budgets or technology wasn't there to produce things like sentient spiders, giant dragons, things like that. There was always that issue. But doing human/humanoid stuff is not only easier for audiences to empathise with, technically, according to some people. I don't tend to empathise particularly with humanoids, just unless I can see that there's a point. But is also easier on the budget. Lest we forget Doctor Who in the classic era. The modern Doctor Who has CGI to fall back on, no matter how cringeworthy it looks. But older Doctor Who, it did manage some non-human entities. Non-humanoid entities. A lot of them are non-human, but non-humanoid. But it was a case of suspension of disbelief for the big jelly blob thing, the giant spider in a crystalline cave, the huge semi-sentient plant. It was that kind of, well, yes, and you look past the occasionally hokey effects. There are definitely points where the effects do not hold up in the slightest. They just look really, really of their time, extremely dated, and you can see why humans in suits was the preferred norm, just because it was cheaper overall and easier to do on the budgets that they had. Of course, that doesn't mean the suits were all of the same quality. They were not. Mostly the strengths of the performances make up for any deficits in that direction. But things like, old Doctor Who, but also Star Trek, Star Wars, especially the earlier unedited ones. If you can find the unedited prints, please watch them. It is a lesson in sort of what they were able to do back then in the 1970s and 80s, because there's a lot of stuff there that it makes the films feel more grounded. It's really nice that those prints exist, and fortunately there's a DVD version that includes the old prints that we've got at home, which is really good because they're around somewhere. They exist, at least for a time. They haven't been completely destroyed by George Lucas. But it's the kind of thing that you notice, and it was really, really driven home to me in Avatar. And to try and be brief about my feelings on Avatar, if they wanted to create something really actually compelling about a person going native, they could have A, not made nearly all the cast white, and B, they could have made the Na'vi less rip-offs of Polynesian and Native American culture. That was a big mistake in my opinion. That just put a whole level of coding in there that was not healthy, but also made them less like basically blue humans with cat faces. You could have done them as painted and costumed with some prosthetic stuff, and I don't think it would have made a huge amount of difference. In fact, it would have probably made it a little bit more enjoyable because there was that suspension of disbelief factor. The whole point of the story is an alien group winning over someone from the other side of a conflict, and I think it would have been so much more compelling if the person had looked past an alien species that wasn't humans in human terms traditionally beautiful, that was obviously more alien, was able to be more easily othered by the human faction, and that would have been really compelling. That would have been interesting. It would have been a human looking past their innate prejudices. But no, we got stunningly beautiful humanoid blue-skinned aliens in get-ups that looked like they were partly ripped from the tribal displays that are put on for tourists by Polynesian peoples, the sort of that area, specific islands, and partly from the 1950s to 60s portrayal of Native Americans, or Red Indians as they were called. Unfortunately, I always think of them as Native Americans. I think I always have thought of them particularly as Native Americans. Just never really thought of them as Indians, because I always had Indian as, well, they come from the Indian subcontinent in Eurasia. They're that group. It helped that where I grew up, there was a Indian from that region of the world. There was a strong community there. I forget whether they were strictly Indian or whether they were Pakistani, but I had that exposure when I was very young, so maybe I'm in a somewhat privileged position. Getting back to, roughly the point of this episode of the podcast, I think that there is something to be said for a diversification in the visual medium. And it's also necessary because, yes, books exist and audiobooks exist, and there the imagination is boundless. But a lot of people get their first exposure to things from stuff like the movies and television and video games. And even if the imagination is unlimited, production budgets are not. Production resources are not. So it's a case of normalization, and that's before you get into studio biases, beauty standards, all that nonsense. You get the phenomenon. You get the phenomenon of people just thinking that all aliens are humanoid, which is a prejudice that has existed for a very long time, partly due to budget, partly due to humans for a long time believing that they were the be-all, end-all of life. That was a thing. But it was a conscious effort for me to break away from that. It also doesn't help that when alien life does go non-humanoid, it tends to be either animalistic or antagonistic. Just compare two different aliens from my early youth. The alien from the Aliens franchise and the hunter creatures from the Predator franchise. The Predator is an antagonist, but their antagonism is defined as they're on a big game hunt, which is a very human pastime. And they are very mortal. They're just enhanced by, yes, they're stronger, but they're enhanced by their technology. So they're inherently a very human-like antagonist. They're like Kano? That hunter bloke from the Marvel comics. I don't remember their name. Whereas the alien is explicitly portrayed as something far more unsettling and icky. It's very much it's a combination of an insect and something more reptilian and a couple of other things. It's very much a non-human predator, especially in the later entries where its form is dictated somewhat by the host it gestates in. So you can have a more humanoid alien that comes from a human, you can have a dog/cow alien, and honestly that aspect of Alien 3 is actually really cool. In fact, I really like Alien 3. It's more enjoyable to me than Aliens. I think partly because Aliens was done by James Cameron and there's not much of his work that's particularly resonated with me outside of the first two Terminators and Titanic, but then Titanic's sort of special. Anyway, the point is that there's that concept. The hunter and predator, you get quite a bit of stuff from their perspective, even in the first film. There's a sense of, we know what they're doing. We know why they're doing this. They're a big game hunter, and the prey is humans, which kind of inverts a lot of prejudices that people have of being the apex predator on the planet. The alien in Alien franchise is something that is very much a creature that is scary and weird and other and a threat and can destroy even trained soldiers with no effort at all. So there is that prejudice there. It's got to be non-human because it's very, very other. Then of course there's also the influence of people like Lovecraft, who created their eldritch gods and alien species. Gods in a loose sense, because technically they're not divine. It's the sense of, if you want to be on the good side of the audience, be human/humanoid, which can make having human-like aliens being the antagonists and the non-human ones being sympathetic or an ally quite the subversion. There's this wonderful classic Doctor Who story called the Leisure Hive, where the antagonistic figures are either disguised as humans, or one of them is actually a member of the humanoid people around which the story revolves, and the reptilian sort of vaguely still humanoid, but then they're people in suits, but they're still quite definitely not human-like. They are quite gentlemanly and friendly and sort of, yeah, it's quite a subversion when you think about it. The concept of the polite and friendly non-human creature. But the fact that it is still a subversion is maybe not a good thing. It should just be another normal. And in books, it is another normal. I have actually encountered several stories where the more human thing is the thing to be feared, whereas the non-human stuff is the thing that may be initially mistrusted or misidentified or misunderstood, but is still on the side of the good things. Yeah, I've run out of the thing. If you want a a couple of stories in book form that do that quite well. There is, of course, Adrian Tchaikovsky's Children of Man. Hold on, is it actually called Children of Man? I forgot to check. That is not how to spell it, but it'll bring something up. Ah, yes, here it is. Children of Time, not Children of Man. I do apologise. I'm not going to correct this. Well, I may put a little insert in later. But Children of Time, there's David Brin's David Brin's Uplift War. There's a bunch of stuff by Ursula Le Guin. Obviously, she is an incredible author in that respect as well. And if you look around and actually take notice, there's quite a few stories in the visual medium or in video games or in television that have non-human characters or factions that are not portrayed as weird, villainous other. So yeah, I do not intend to attach anything else into this episode. This was just a prolonged rant, maybe, on this subject, which is interesting to me because I'm still having to fight against those preconceptions myself when I am creating stories, be they science fiction ones or fantasy. Fantasy, it's a little harder for me in some respects. The science fiction one, the series that's approaching publication at the moment, one of the books has a basically octopus species, and they are definitely not humanoid, they are octopus-like, and I had to think up the type of language they would use, how they would think of some things, and they definitely come off as not that like the other peoples and creatures in that universe, which I think is a plus. Let's see how much of my initial concept for them survives the editing process and gets to publication. Hopefully most of it, maybe even all of it, maybe I'll even add some stuff. So, ladies, gentlemen, and everyone in between, thank you for listening. I hope you have a great couple more weeks, and see you next time.